Oh, hey! Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Colin Seeberger from Young Invincibles. Young Invincibles, I'm our strategic campaigns advisor, so I do a lot of work on federal higher education policy with our staff. Super excited to talk to you today about how we can make higher education better work for students. I don't need to tell many of you who are feeling firsthand just how broken our higher education system is, that it's too costly, tuition's gone up astronomically, and financial aid hasn't kept pace with tuition. We've got a system that's not accountable, its quality is being threatened, and also we've got a system in which that's produced more than 42 million student borrowers that have some sort of loan debt after graduation. Before graduation, that is. So today I'm going to go over just a few of the areas of federal higher education policy that we can make some changes right away and really have a tangible benefit for students. So to get us started, we are going to talk about modernizing the Pell Grant program. The Pell Grant program is a program that provides aid to low-income and middle-income students. More than 8 million students, or about 8 million students or so, benefit directly every year from the Pell Grant program. And there are three different areas of reform for the Pell Grant program that could really strengthen it. The first is making sure that the Pell Grant actually reflects the true cost of college today. So when the Pell Grant program got started about four decades ago, the program actually covered about 77% of the cost of attendance. Today, that number is actually less than a third. And so, because tuition costs have risen pretty substantially over the course, especially over the course of the last decade. So, what we call for is actually increasing the max Pell Grant, so that it actually reflects the cost of attendance today. There's a bill right now actually in Congress that would take the max grant up from $5,810 up to about $9,400 to actually reflect the average in-state public college and university tuition level. Additionally, we could do a thing called restoring year-round Pell Grants. So right now, if you're going to school full-time in both the fall and the spring semesters, you're currently ineligible from being able to receive Pell Grant assistance during the summer. And that has a number of different negative consequences. It requires people to stay in school longer in order to be able to complete their degrees, and that obviously can have impacts on how much student debt you have to take out. And so we'd like to see a restoration of the year-round Pell Grant program. From 2009 to about 2011, Congress actually, we actually had a year-round Pell Grant program, but in 2011, Congress actually scrapped that. And it's obviously doesn't really make much sense, and there's actually some bipartisan support for restoring that program, and so we think that's an area of policy that we can start having an immediate impact on students and the amount of debt that they're having to take out right away. Finally, we want to make sure that we're fighting efforts to restrict program eligibility. So right now, like I said, about 8 million students benefit from the Pell Grant program. We want to make sure that that program isn't cut down so that only 5 million people are benefiting. If anything, we should be expanding program eligibility, not tailoring program eligibility, because right now there are too many American families that are having a tough time being able to finance their higher education. Next, we're going to talk about simplifying the federal financial aid application process called the FAFSA. So currently, right now, actually, speaking of the Pell Grant program, 820,000 graduates did not complete the FAFSA application process in the 2013 to 2014 academic year. And what that meant is that actually those 820,000 graduates, they left nearly $2.9 billion of free aid on the table. $2.9 billion, that's a substantial amount of money, and it's it's an amount of money actually that could really go a long way towards helping expand access to higher education, as well as limit the amount of debt that graduates are having to take on in order to be able to finish. So there are a few areas of reform that we can look at to make sure that the financial aid application process is a lot easier. One we can reduce the number of questions. Right now there are over 100 questions on the FAFSA application form, which is pretty burdensome for students and families to collect all of that information and file the application and make sure that they're meeting all the deadlines so that way they can be eligible for as much aid as possible. And so what we would like to see, and this is actually an action that the Obama administration recently announced last year and is going into effect in the fall of 2016, is that prior year's tax information will no longer be used, and instead we'll be using prior year's tax information. So what does that mean? Basically what that means is that if you're applying for financial aid for the 2017-2018 application year, you can actually use tax information rather than from 2016, you can use tax information from the year before. So that way your parents aren't having to complete that tax. Oftentimes the FAFSA deadline is around February 15th of every year. And so rather than having to get your W-2s, file your taxes at the very end of January, beginning of early February, you can actually, in order to meet that February 15th deadline, is you can actually use the preceding year's tax information. And one of the ways that we can make this a lot easier is by improving the IRS data retrieval tool. So basically what this does is if we improved that, we could end up actually eliminating about 90% of the questions on the FAFSA form and just having that tax information, your family's tax information, patched through directly from the IRS onto your actual FAFSA application form can make it a whole lot easier for students and families to get the aid that they qualify for. Like I said, $3 billion, or right about $3 billion in free money, essentially, through the Pell Grant program was left on the table, but up to $24 billion in federal WorkStudy, Pell Grants, college loans was left on the table just as recently as a few years ago. Next, we're going to talk about combating state divestment. State divestment is a huge threat to college students and their ability to be able to afford a higher education. Currently, 48 states are spending, on average, less per full-time student than they were prior to the Great Recession. And so what does that mean? That means that we've seen 21%, or we've seen states cut their per full-time student higher education budgets 28% since the Great Recession. And in the meantime, we've seen that shift, that balance shift onto the backs of students and families, and they're having to cover 21% higher on average tuition costs. That makes it a whole lot harder for people to afford to get into college and stay in college, and we think that state divestment is actually a really significant threat to college completion. Students and families, when they apply to college and they get into school, they should know how much they're going to end up being on the being on the hook for. And so state divestment can dramatically change how much students and families are having to pay out of pocket from when they enter to when they're a junior or a senior, looking at tuition rates that have gone up in some cases 30, 40, 50%. And in states like Arizona, where they've zeroed out community funding for the state's two largest community college systems, or in New Hampshire, where in 2011 the state legislature actually slashed the state's higher education funding in half. Those are significant threats to public college and university students in states like Arizona and New Hampshire. And like I said, there are 48 states right now that are spending less on higher education than they were prior to the Great Recession. And so, how do we combat state divestment? One of the things that we can do is we can set up an incentive program of sorts to get states to restore their funding for higher education. This can be structured in a number of different ways. I'm sure many of you have probably heard of the K-12 program called Race to the Top. Essentially what it did was it asked states to set quality standards for education in their states to make sure that our K-12 students were getting a quality early and secondary education in this country, and those states were in turn rewarded with some sort of federal grant. So like I said, there are a number of different ways that we can do this. One of them is, one of the ways that we can set up an incentive structure is through block grants that meet certain requirements. We could do a Pell Grant matching program, so that way schools that are doing the best job of serving our most in-need students are then rewarded for providing them that education. Or a flexible federal approach that gives states the discretion to determine where their tuition and assistance, how that's structured. Finally, the federal WorkStudy program. I'm sure this is something that many of you have either interacted with yourselves or have heard about or have friends that benefit from the program. So currently right now, a little over 700,000 students benefit from the federal WorkStudy program. We spend about $1 billion a year on the federal WorkStudy program, but right now, how that money is doled out is not done effectively. And so currently, schools that have relatively few low-income students actually receive more federal work-study funds than those that serve our most low and middle-income students. And we think that that's fundamentally broken and is a fundamental problem in our system. And so what we would like to see is an update to that distribution formula. We recommend replacing the existing formula, which is based on an arbitrary formula from the late 1990s. We would replace that with a new design that rewards institutions that enroll and graduate Pell eligible students in proportionally higher numbers. That way we're focusing aid where it's most needed in schools that are serving our most low and middle income students. Additionally, we would increase the program. So like I said, right now we serve only 700,000 students every year in the federal work-study program. We think that we could scale that pretty dramatically to about 2 million students if we ended up tripling funding for the program to about $3 billion every year. Next, you will find, so people, when they're thinking about higher education, they think about that high school senior that just graduated from college, they turn their tassel and, ship right off to school. That's not the reality in our higher education system today. More than a third of students are working part, if not full time. We've got more than 1 in 4 students today on a college campus actually are student parents. And so we think that there's actually a lot of work that we could be doing to help support, what the modern student looks like today, today's student. So one of the places that we can do that is supporting our student parents. So right now we actually have 26% of all students are parents. We've got about 250,000 student parents that are actually living in poverty. And so if we're going to help not just that student be able to get that degree, but their child to be able to have a parent who's reaping the benefits of a credential that's providing them greater income, so that way they're better able to provide for their families, we need to be dramatically scaling up our support for student parents on campus. And one of the areas that student parents have told us at Young Invincibles about that's the greatest burden to them is being able to balance childcare responsibilities with their academic studies. And so there's a program right now called C-Campus, which stands for Childcare Access Means Parents in School. And C-Campus right now is about a $16 million a year program. It provides grants to about 86 institutions across the country, supporting 5,000 of today's student parents with more affordable childcare. So just so you can get a sense for what I'm talking about here, there's a program at UW-Madison, right? That's a C-Campus recipient. And UW-Madison student Alejandra Lira, in a recent Atlantic article, testified that her childcare cost went from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars, I think it was $600 to $700 a month, down to just $120 a semester. So you can imagine that's a significant thousands of dollars every semester that they're saving. And so you can only imagine that savings over the course of a semester, and you multiply that out by multiple semesters, is providing a significant savings in terms of either how much debt that they're having to take out, their ability to be able to stay in school. You know, the C campus students that I've spoken to have told me that it's really helped them be able to focus on their studies too, because it's not just about getting that degree, it's about making sure that students are actually learning the skills that they need, so that way when they enter the workforce after graduation, they're actually able to get the jobs that they've been being prepared for throughout school. So we would like to see the C campus program expanded so that way it's covering every student parent that's actually living in poverty. Like I said, that's 250,000 students, and so that would require about a $250 million investment in the program. We're scaling it up to $250 million. There's a current proposal in Congress that would actually take the 5,000 student program, the C campus program, up from 5,000 up to a little more than 25,000. That's sponsored by Congresswoman Duckworth from Illinois. And that program would cost about $67 million, I believe. And so there is some current legislation to expand the program, but as we're getting into HEA next year, the Higher Education Act reauthorization, we think that focusing on today's students is going to be a really important place for us to focus this conversation. Next, data reform. You may not understand, or it may not come naturally to you what I'm meaning by data reform, but right now, students and families can't answer fundamental questions about what their college outcomes can expect to look like after graduation. So right now, students and families don't have information when they're applying to schools and entering certain programs to be able to tell you, okay, well, what's the average student debt that a graduate from this kind of program at this kind of school is having to take on? What is the likelihood that I'm going to be able to get a job in my field after I graduate? What is the likelihood that I'm going to be able to pay off those student loans? A whole bunch of different information like that students and families just don't have access to. And part of the reason why that is because in 2008, when Congress last reauthorized the Higher Education Act, they passed something called the Student Unit Record Ban. That Student Unit Record Ban essentially shields a $500 billion a year higher education system from transparency. And that's not serving students, it's not serving taxpayers, it's not serving our employers. And so we think actually overturning that ban so that way students and families have more of that information up front, we're going to help protect both students and families as well as taxpayers' investments. And for something that's oftentimes the second greatest investment that students are going to make in their entire life besides potentially buying a house, it's natural to ask for that kind of information on the front end. Just to put it this way, a hedge fund manager on Wall Street would never invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a fund if they didn't know what kind of return that they would be expecting. That's why they get prospectuses. So data reform, college outcomes information, definitely key in making sure that we're making improvements to our higher education system and getting real results and accountability from our schools as well. Speaking of accountability from schools, risk sharing is actually another area that we can focus on to make sure that schools are serving students, not themselves. So, and we can do that through incentivizing schools to keep their costs down. And we can do that by making sure that a school's access to federal financial aid is linked with that school's graduates' ability to repay their loans. If a school is producing graduates who half of whom are defaulting on their debt, or 90% of which have not been able to pay off their loans, is that school really providing students with the quality education that they need to get a good paying job after graduation? I think that's skeptical. And that's definitely an area that there are some questions that need to be looked at. And so a risk-sharing model would incentivize schools to keep those costs down so they're not charging students unnecessarily. Additionally, also, a risk-sharing model could really incentivize schools to focus the money that they're getting in tuition and fees and whatnot in studies, rather than on luxurious dorms or new football fields, things like that, new recreational facilities, and really could focus those funds on supporting academic instruction. But this risk-sharing model shouldn't come at the expense of other accountability measures that we already have. Things like the 90-10 rule that prevent for-profit colleges from getting more than 90% of their revenue from federal financial aid. Things like gainful employment that actually hold some of those career college programs accountable for their outcomes. We should be strengthening those rules, not weakening them, and definitely not scrapping them. Finally, also, like I mentioned up at the top, we've got more than 42 million people across the country that have taken out student debt in order to be able to get their higher education. And there's some serious reforms that we should be looking at to make sure that that process is as flexible, manageable, and easy to navigate as possible. One of them is improving access to income-based repayment. So right now, everybody in the country that has a federal loan is actually eligible for an income-based repayment program. What is an income-based repayment program? An income-based repayment program basically allows you to pay off your loans as a proportion of your adjusted gross income. So essentially, just to put it in perspective of what that means for a student borrower. For myself, when I graduated school, my student loan payments would have been about $600 a month had I not enrolled in an income-based repayment program. By enrolling in an income-based repayment program, that allowed me to bring that payment down to about $200 every month. You can imagine, and I can tell you from my own experience, that $400 every month makes a dramatic difference in the lives of people like myself when I graduated, as well as many of the other young people that I know that are having a hard time getting started, getting on their feet after college. It makes a huge, huge difference. So we should be making it easier to enroll in those programs. Currently, only about 4.8 million of our 42 million federal student loan borrowers are actually enrolled in that program. So there's more that we can be doing in terms of either automatically enrolling borrowers in that program or public education efforts that we can be pursuing to expand enrollment in those programs. That's where our attention needs to be. Additionally, also, we should be allowing borrowers to refinance their student loans. So currently, if you have a mortgage, if you have an auto loan, you can refinance those loans. Even state and local governments can refinance their loans, but student borrowers aren't able to refinance their loans. And so there's a proposal actually in Congress that Senator Elizabeth Warren has been championing that would actually help 25 million student loan borrowers be able to save on average about $2,000 over the course of the lifetime of their loans. That could be a substantial help to student borrowers. Additionally, we need to install some greater consumer protections for private student loan borrowers. So currently, right now, there are $8.1 billion in private student loans that are currently in default. And these private student loans don't have the same consumer protections that federal loans do. Things like a deferment in the time of economic hardship. Things like in those income-based repayment programs that I was just talking about. Private student loan borrowers aren't eligible to enroll in those types of plans. And so we need to be installing some greater protections for those students, and especially at a time when, as tuition has gotten more expensive, some families are actually meeting their federal loan limits and are having no choice but to take out those private loans if they want to stay in school. And we know the greatest threat to students taking out debt is them not completing, because they're not realizing those income gains associated with getting that credential. And so we definitely need to make sure that we're supporting students that have to take out those private student loans. Finally, also, we need to be cracking down on student loan servicers that are taking advantage of their student borrowers. So, student loan servicers should be directing payments to loans that have the highest interest rates. They should be informing you when they sell your loans over to another company. They should be working with you, not harassing you. Oftentimes that borrowers are getting, calls first thing in the morning, 10 o'clock at night, and if, say a borrower is late on a payment, they should be working with you on making this as easy as possible to navigate, not making it more challenging. So that's really what we got here. There's a lot of reforms that we can make to make higher education better work for today's students. And I just want to say it's never been more important for you to be involved in impacting federal higher education policy. Next year, we're going to reauthorize the major federal law that governs all things higher education. It's called the Higher Education Act. And so this covers everything from your Pell Grants to your college loans to the federal WorkStudy program to how you repay those loans. And so, this happened last in 2008. This is the most important time to be involved in affecting higher education policy. And so I hope you'll join us. You can go to younginvincibles.org, click on the Join Us tab. You can also follow us on Twitter at Young Invincible. That's Young Invincibles, but with no S. Or you can email me at Colin, Colin, .seeberger, SEEBERGER, at younginvincibles.org. I look forward to working with you more, and thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video. Thanks.